Remember me? Remember them. Your best work can be easily undone. In the face of your best work undone, perhaps you will see that success is not what you have accomplished, but how you have lived. Pastor Peter Ng at the Well will now open God's Word to us from the book of Nehemiah in our journey through the Bible. The scripture text for our message is from Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 6 through 14, verse 22, and verses 29 through 31. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God, with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, "Why is the house of God neglected?" Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. All Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan son of Zaccur, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God. The word of the Lord.
Now, I'd like to say that we are coming to the close of the Old Testament. We have 2 more weeks to go, and then we'll be, or rather in 2 weeks, we'll be into the New Testament during our anniversary. So the Old Testament period ends with the people returning from the exile. They were exiled into Babylon and they came back. And how they pick up the broken pieces of their nation and also of their individual lives, because the two are really related. You cannot talk about a broken nation without people not having broken lives, and you cannot talk about the entire community having broken lives and the nation not being broken. Now, the story of Nehemiah is where we are at. We're at the second part of this story. The story of Nehemiah is that he was the cupbearer of the Persian king. As he was the cupbearer, he learns that those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. So this is how the story of Nehemiah begins. Now God gives Nehemiah a special burden for his people and granted him special favor with the king. So the king gave Nehemiah leave to go back to the province of Judah and to fix the problems there. And the king appointed him governor of the province while he was there. So Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem. He organized the people. He rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem in the face of great opposition. And among the people who opposed him were two names that we should note. And the first is Sanballat the Horonite, and the next is Tobiah the Ammonite. So Sanballat and Tobiah were the chief people who opposed the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Now, despite the opposition, Nehemiah completed the wall building, and he set in order the worship and the administration of the temple, and then he returned to the capital of Persia, Susa, after a long 12-year break. After a time, he decided to return to Jerusalem to see how things were coming along. And to his great horror, things had become really bad in his absence. Now, we do not know how long he was back in Susa, probably not very long. But when he went back to Jerusalem, everything had fallen apart, and he was deeply, deeply disappointed. And he goes about fixing things for a second time. And the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, closes with Nehemiah coming to terms with how his reforms just don't seem to take root. He knows he will not always be around, and the people really need to hold themselves accountable to God more than to him. But it seems as if when he is not around, things are no good anymore. And even as he holds himself accountable to God, he wants the people to hold themselves accountable to God. Now, as we read this chapter, there is a painful refrain. Now, this term remember me or remember them is not unique to chapter 13, but you see this repeated in chapter 13. In chapter 13, verse 14, Nehemiah says, "Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services." And then again, in Nehemiah 13:22, "Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this also, my God, and show me mercy according to your great love." And then in verse 29, "Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites." And then again in 31, "I also made provision for contributions of wood at the designated times and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, my God." So this is somewhat of a sad refrain. It is sad because he is calling on God as witness, not in a self-righteous way, but he is saying that the people just do not recognize the work that is being done. And he says, "God, look on me with grace." Well, he knows that folks are not going to remember him. Things are not going to be done once he's gone. But he's saying, "God, I really tried." Now, when do you make a statement like this? If you were to come to God and say, "God, I really tried. Remember me for that." Okay. This is usually said in the face of failure, not in the face of success. You have done everything that you can do, and then you feel that you have failed, and you come to God and say, "God, remember me. Remember me, that what I've done." And then when you say something like, "God, remember them," you know what it is? It is like you have given up. You don't know what else to do with them. And then you say, "God, remember them. For these people that want to obey you, I cannot make them accountable to you, but Lord, you make them accountable to you." So Nehemiah could only change the actions of the people, but without a changed heart, the people quickly relapsed. So Nehemiah 13 is about a nation's relapse, but it is also about Nehemiah's struggle with the relapse of the nation. It is just like a drug addict. A drug addict can be locked up. In Singapore today, if you are a drug addict, I think for the second time you are caught, they lock you up for a really long time, even for more than other criminal offenses, because they want to condition the behavior of this drug addict. They want to take him away from drugs, and they lock him up for a long time. But the reality is this: unless during that time of lockup, the addict has a change of heart, Without that change of heart, once the restraints are removed, the drug addict will relapse. And so this is what Nehemiah was struggling with. People relapsing the minute the restraints were removed. So remember me, remember them is also a much more introspective way of addressing the wrongs that others do and not let them get to you. If somebody does something wrong to you, and you can say, like in some places in the Old Testament, the Lord judged between thee and me. Quite a few times you see that in the Old Testament. It's like there's a right or wrong, yes or no, you are either right or I'm right. But this is a gentler call to God to set right the things that we ourselves cannot set right. And having set something right, we are not sure if it's going to go bad again. So you may say that the life of Nehemiah did not have a fairy tale ending. There was no happily ever after. And the true end of our life story will also be like that. It is not going to be at the end of our lives. We're not going to say, oh, I've set everything in order and everything is honky-dory and it's all good now. In fact, if you were to look at the lives of most people, it will show more failures than successes, and that is going to be true for you and me. And at the end of the day, we dare not really ask God to evaluate us according to our success. We can only ask God to remember our effort and call on His grace. And our duty is to live accountable lives before God. So then, our accountability to God lies not in the success of what we do, but in the success of how we live. And that is as good as it can get. So the close of Nehemiah's life throws up 4 aspects of life that we need to be accountable to God. And the first, I call it as an address to God, God, hold me accountable for how I serve. God, hold me accountable for how I serve. And in some ways, this is more relevant about me than about you, but as your pastor, that becomes relevant to you too. Now, we see in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 4, before this, that means before Nehemiah got back to Jerusalem, Eliashib the priest had been put in charge of the storehouses of the house of our God. So Eliashib the priest, he was actually the high priest. But I think Nehemiah didn't want to overstate the failure and just call him the priest. But Eliashib was actually the high priest. And he was closely associated with, well, guess who? Tobiah. This person that we looked at earlier, Sanballat and Tobiah. These were the chief antagonists. And not only was he closely associated with him, he had provided him with a large room, not just any large room, an important room. The room that was formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles and also the tithes of grain, new wine and olive oil prescribed for the Levites, musicians and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. So here we see a major problem. And this text continues and said that I came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing that Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased. So what did he do? I threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offerings and incense. Now, who were these people? Who were Sanballat and Tobiah? We see a description given to us in Nehemiah 2:19. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. So these were people who actively discouraged the people of God. They were mocking, they were ridiculing, they wanted God's people to fail. And that was what was happening. And yet Eliashib, of all people, the high priest, welcomed them into the house of God and gave them a room. The next is when Sanballat, that is in chapter 4 verse 7, when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs of Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead, they all plotted together to fight against Jerusalem and stir trouble against it. So they were not just people who were mocking verbally, but they were planning to fight against the people of God. So this was a really serious enemy. They were enemies who wanted to destroy the work that was being done. And another text is this, in 6:12, I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. So Tobiah and Sanballat hired prophets to confuse the things and to prophesy against what Nehemiah was doing. So Nehemiah said, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So this is another action that they did. They tried to create spiritual confusion. And then, also in those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. So what we are seeing is this: Tobiah was not a standalone. There were nobles in Judah who were trying to get his help. So there was actually a political fight going on between Tobiah and Nehemiah. And the people who didn't like Nehemiah, because he is now the governor, he's now putting things in place, perhaps they were sidelined, they turned to Tobiah for support. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah, son of Erah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Moreover, they kept reporting to me his good deeds and then telling him what I said. And Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. So Nehemiah was struggling with a problem. He had moles working together with him. There were people who were spying on him and reporting to Tobiah. So Tobiah was a really serious problem during that time. He was a real thorn in the side. His son married the daughter of a powerful Israelite, and so he was deeply involved in the politics of the Israelites. And many would have lost their influence because of Nehemiah, and they gathered around Tobiah instead. So now, what is the problem with Eliashib the high priest? I think the problem is a serious one. We are told that he was closely associated with Tobiah, and then he provided him this large room. So the problem that we see here really is nepotism. Nepotism is a serious thing. You know, when my family and we first moved to, we were living in New Jersey, and our home was right past the governor's mansion. If we were to go to town and go home, we would drive right past the governor's mansion, the governor of New Jersey. And so the governor was never far from our minds. Now, the funny thing about Princeton is this: it's such a well-known city, but the roads are deplorable. There are all these potholes in the roads, and the taxes are horrendously high. So that kept me asking the question, where do the tax money go? I mean, we pay so much for property tax. How come the roads are not repaired? And guess what? It came out that the governor was actually corrupt. He was involved in nepotism. He hired a man who was not qualified to do a top job, and it turned out that this man that he hired was his homosexual lover. And so this is nepotism and embezzlement. And it was the same with Eliashib. He was using temple resources for his personal friend. And this friend was actually, said to say, an enemy of God and of God's people. So he was good friend to the enemy. Now there is something really wrong about this. I'm not sure how he could be a good friend to the enemy of God's people and still be a true servant of God. Well, the short answer is he wasn't a true servant of God. But the problem is he was a high priest. So what was happening? I think the big problem we have is that there was no accountability. You see, as the high priest, he was answerable to no one because he was high priest by succession from Aaron. And so he was not accountable. He was not accountable to the people. He was not answerable to them. He was only answerable to God. And in that sense, we need to be very, very careful. Now, I'm glad to say that there's been no reports of nepotism in our circles for a very, very long time. And so I'm happy to say we don't have to address this issue as a direct issue. But what remains true is this: is that many people have been disappointed by Christian leaders before. If you were a Jew living in or around Jerusalem at that time and you see all these things happening, you would have been terribly disappointed with Eliashib and with his nepotism. And also his inviting Tobiah into the temple. You know what it is? It is like inviting the fox into the hen house. I mean, you want to put the fox together with the chickens? How can you do that? It's evidently wrong and foolish to do that. It's self-evident that it is wrong and foolish for him to do that. But in terms of accountability, you will remember the story when we were in the times of Judges, that there was this high priest called Eli. And he had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. And they were like that. They totally disregarded their positions as sons of the high priest, who would be the next high priest. One of them would have become one. And so God got rid of them because of their terrible wickedness. But in some sense, this is even worse. This was not the high priest's sons that were doing it. It was the high priest himself who was misbehaving. And there was nobody to whom he was accountable. Nehemiah could not make him accountable because Eliashib was appointed by succession, and Nehemiah would not have the authority to replace Eliashib. Now, it is important for us to note this. A person cannot say, I'm not accountable to you, I'm only accountable to God. You know, some pastors would say things like that. I'm accountable to God, I'm not accountable to you. I think that is not right. That is not right because we are not pastors by some kind of succession. We are ultimately accountable to God, that is true, but we are also accountable to God through the people that are around. And the reality is that spiritual leaders need to be accountable. There are out of proportion media representation of pastors who spend a lot of the church money, millions and millions of dollars, and they end up not being accountable to the members. They hide all these facts, and that is not right. We need to be accountable to one another. We need to be accountable for the nice things, but also for the unpleasant things. For the nice things, what I mean is this. Jesus says, by this, all men shall know you are my disciples if you have love one for another. So I owe you my love and you owe me my love. And we can talk about these nice things about accountability. You know, we need to encourage one another to love one another. But there's also an unpleasant aspect of the accountability when things go wrong. And so for me as myself, I need to say that God needs to hold me accountable for how I serve. And you too have the right to hold me accountable. Just a quick note that different churches have different systems of accountability for their pastors, and so we do not need to go into that. But every church is supposed to have a system of accountability. And of course, that brings us to the second point, and that is God, hold me accountable for how your servants are supported. You see, the text here tells us that Nehemiah also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them. So what he did was that he rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Okay, so he rectified the situation. So because the Levites and the musicians were all not paid, they had to go home and do their own jobs to support their families. And because of that, the temple work and the house of God was neglected. So then, when he set everything in order, all Judah brought the tithes and grain and new wine and all that, and then he put the responsible people to be in charge of their supplies. Now, so basically the scenario was something like this. The people had given their tithes. It was in the storehouse. But the officials who were distributing to the Levites did not do their jobs. No, for some reason, they just kept the money and they didn't pay the people who were supposed to be paid. The Levites then, who didn't have the means of support, went home so that they could do something else to support themselves and their families. And then when that happened, of course, the people also stopped giving. And Nehemiah ordered the officials to do their jobs. And when they started giving again, Nehemiah appointed other officials. And perhaps Tobiah had something to do with it, because you notice that Tobiah's location was in the room where all the things were supposed to be gathered. Okay, so The text doesn't really tell us what exactly that relationship is, but I think it's more than coincidence that the room that he was gathered was where the tithes were supposed to have been put, and now he is the one occupying it, okay? And the tithes and all the other offerings were going to another place. Now, so the equivalent for us in our day would be something like this. Okay, you come to church, you present your tithes, your offerings, but somehow you discover that the church staff are not paid, and that the treasury of the church gets fatter and fatter. But God's servant staff, then they have to leave the work of the Lord and go and support their family. Well, that would have been the equivalent of the dire straits that the situation was in and what Nehemiah discovered. Now, these were the things that happened in the Old Testament. We don't have a temple today, we have the church. But then what are the New Testament principles? Well, the New Testament principles are basically drawn from the Old Testament, and they are quite similar. But we also see a new spirit coming into play here. You see, in the Old Testament, God's servants should be fully supported, and this would be the same in the New Testament too. The question, though, is what happens if they are not supported? And this is where the Old and the New Testament differs a little bit. You see, in the case of Nehemiah, when the God's servants were not supported, they said, okay, goodbye, I'm going home to support my family. We have a case of what we are supposed to do during these New Testament times. We have the case of the Apostle Paul and how he related to the Philippians and the Corinthians. The Philippians were very generous people. They supported Paul, and so Paul could focus on God's work. But the Corinthians were very suspicious people. They look upon Paul and say, maybe you are doing this for the sake of money. Maybe you are trying to extract things from us. And so Paul knew their attitude, and so Paul didn't touch a single cent from the Corinthians. While he was serving the Corinthians, other Christians supported him, and he also supplemented it by doing the tent-making business with his two friends, Aquila and Priscilla. And so this is the relationship that we are looking at, in that in the New Testament, even when God's servants are not paid, the servants of God who feel so called will continue to work, will live by faith with or without support. Today, there are many examples of good and bad pastors, and I ask you to have some discernment, because there are some pastors who live in opulence, and there are some pastors who live in simplicity. And of course, I do not need to talk about the pastors who live in opulence in Singapore, because you know who they are. But I'd like to give you an example of a pastor who lives with simplicity. His name is Francis Chan, and some of you may have heard his sermon or watched his video on YouTube also. He's a very successful preacher. He grew his church huge, and he wrote books, and his books were selling very well, and he was making a lot of money from his book sales. You know what he did? He created a trust fund so that all his book sales would go into that trust fund. He doesn't even touch the book sales money. And then all that money goes into missions. And he himself lives very simply. And now I'm so impressed by his simple life. I think I live a simple life, but I think he lives a life of even greater simplicity. So there are many, many faithful servants of the Lord who do that, who live simple lives in order that they can be a true blessing to other people. Now, in our situation, I'm glad to share with you that our leaders have done a good job in financial management. I say this because this is what the text is saying. I'm not saying that the church hasn't paid us. Okay, we have been paid. So don't think that it is a hint of any sort that the church has not paid us. Now, so let us keep on in this good work. Now, if the congregation wishes to know more about how we are paid and all these, there's a schedule, there's a structure for that, and you can always ask. And we hold periodic conversations, and you are always welcome to raise a question any time of the year, and we'll be happy to be accountable to you. And this is probably all we need to say on this point. I want to go on to our next point. The next point, I'll address it as God hold me accountable for the day of rest. So in Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 15, we are told that the people of Judah were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. So what was happening was that they were just breaking the Sabbath blatantly. It wasn't as if they were just doing it quietly or doing a little bit of it. like it was done blatantly and nobody was keeping the Sabbath. So what did he do? Well, he learned about it and then he implemented. When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not open until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. So that was the problem. You see, the people had swore earlier on that they are going to keep the rest day holy, but without the legal imposition that Nehemiah put on them, they would do whatever they want. You know, today there are not many countries that would still impose a rest day. I know Germany does, and I was quite surprised because Germany is quite a secular country, and while I was in Germany, I found that, everything is closed on Sunday. At first, I wasn't used to that, but after a while, once you get used to the so-called inconvenience, I begin to appreciate it much more, to see, well, this is really how it looks like if people were to rest on Sunday. Well, Nehemiah's solution was to impose a rest day. But again, it is something that can be imposed, and yet it cannot be imposed. And let me discuss with you a little bit what we're talking about. You see, I know of two countries that impose a rest day. One is Germany, and the other one is Israel. They impose it on different days. Germany on Sunday, Israel on Saturday. But you know, both countries are doing very well financially. And Germany is doing very well. Israel is doing very well. Singapore is not even able to catch up with either of these two countries. So from the practical standpoint, the negative impact of resting one day in 7, that is the financial impact of it, is actually not much. Because you see that these two countries have done very well with a rest day, with an imposed rest day. But I think the other thing about the pandemic is this. The pandemic economy shows us that it can be done. Shops were closed on Sundays. In fact, many things were closed on Sundays. Not only on Sundays, they were closed every day of the week. And yet life could go on. People can cook on Sundays. The family can get together on Sundays. So if there's anything that I think this pandemic tells us about a shop opening or closing, that it actually can be done. Now, can we then do it on a personal level? I think yes and no. I think we can do it at a personal level, even though the society may be running on 24/7. Well, first of all, if you have got a job that requires you to work on a Sunday, yes, you can look for a job that does not require you to work on a Sunday. Well, the exceptions are always this, the works of necessity and the works of mercy. These are things that have to go on, and these are not part of the equation. But no, we cannot really do it because we cannot really change society. Let me explain what I mean. If I feel very convicted that Sunday should be a day of rest, and then I say, well, I'm not going to buy food on Sunday because I'm making other people work. Guess what? I can boycott all the food establishments on every single Sunday of my life. And do you think they'll still be open? You can be sure they'll still be open. I can not go shopping on Sunday, and will they still be open? Absolutely. So in a certain sense, in order for this to work, both sides must work. There must be an administrative imposition from the top, and there must be the people's willingness from the bottom. But this is not what we're going to see anytime soon. But if some of you go into politics, perhaps this is something that you can consider. This is something that if you have the influence to influence the nature of the economy and the country. Now, the next point that I have to say here is relevant to our young people, especially if you're single and you're planning to get married. This is a sensitive point, but it need not be a sensitive point. And the next point is this: God, hold me accountable for my marriage. See, we are told that in those days, I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses on them. I beat on the men and pulled out their hair. Boy, Nehemiah is a really expressive guy, right? Passionate guy that we talked about last week. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not going to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you going to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves. So that was what he did. He made them take an oath. Now, in addition, we are told that one of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, and I drove him away. So you see that Eliashib was connected not just to Tobiah, but also to Sanballat through marriage. So I don't know what kind of a high priest that guy was. And Nehemiah says, I will have nothing to do with him. I drove him away. He was no longer a staff within the administration of the city. Remember them, my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Well, first of all, let's see what the Old Testament has to say about marrying people who are on the outside. There are some Old Testament principles involved. There was not a blanket prohibition, meaning they cannot marry outside of Israel at all. That wasn't the prohibition. But the first prohibition really is don't sleep with the enemy. We see this in the case as the Israelites were moving into Israel. The men slept with the Moabite women and they ended up engaging in idolatry and judgment fell on them. We saw the case of Samson, who loved Philistine girls, and he slept with them, and that led to his ruin. We saw the problem with King Solomon and how women became his problem, and he couldn't manage that. Okay, so don't sleep with the enemy. But by the same token, not everyone was prohibited. Like we just saw 2 weeks ago, Esther, who was a Jewish woman, married the king of Persia. We see all the way back in the case of Joseph, who married an Egyptian woman, and so forth. So what was prohibited was sleeping with the enemy. And also the other thing was that they could not marry people who were also claiming to the land. That means people who are other claimants of the land. So don't sleep with your enemy included those, or the people who were specified were the Canaanites who were claiming the land. And then don't marry those who take you away from your faith. So these are the two principles. Here the people broke the rule at a time when they were in real danger of losing their identity and their inheritance. At one time, the Israelites were the majority, but they were exiled, and only 50,000 people came back. So it was a relatively small community, while in their absence, all kinds of people had flooded in, and if they begin to intermarry, they will begin to lose their identity as Israel. So we are told then that Nehemiah beat them up, literally. And he made them take an oath to desist, to say that from now on we won't do it. Now, but what was happening? You see, when Nehemiah left for Persia after 12 years, they had already taken an oath. In fact, in Nehemiah chapter 10 verse 30, they said this, we promise not to give our daughters in marriage to the peoples around us or take their daughters for our sons. And also concerning the Sabbath, they had also taken an oath earlier. When the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any other holy day. Every 7th year we will forego working the land and will cancel all debts. So they had already made a commitment. And what could Nehemiah do? Well, Nehemiah just had to make them swear one more time. Okay. So they swore once before, they didn't keep it. He made them swear one more time. And maybe you can understand why he is saying, God, remember the work that I've done. God, remember the work, remember them. Okay, remember my work. It was almost like swimming up against the river, and the minute you want to relax a little bit, you get pushed back again. So this issue of marrying the enemy was just like the day of rest. And of course, the terrible thing was that the family of the high priest was doing it. And so, of course, everybody else was doing it. So then the question is this. Today, how can we be accountable? How to be accountable for your marriage? As you look for a life partner and all that, the same principles apply. The same principle. The first is don't sleep with the enemy. There are some people who are not believers but also not enemy. But there are some people who are not believers and are the enemy. So no sleeping with the enemy. The second thing is don't marry anyone who takes away your faith. So there are people who would be out to undo your faith. And so you really need to keep away from these people. But the fourth thing I like to suggest is this, to engage your parents and your church leaders. Remember it says here that we'll not do it and we'll not let our children do it. So marriage is a family thing. Let me tell you a little bit of a family story. One day I had a conversation with my daughter Crystal, about her going out with guys. That was some years back before she got married. And I presented to her the courtship model. And that is to say, when a guy asks to go out with you, perhaps you want to consider saying this, okay, could you talk to my father first and ask his permission before you take me out? And if he cannot speak to me face to face, it means that there is something wrong with his asking you out. And when I meet the guy, I can ask him questions that you cannot ask. It's very awkward for you to ask questions that I can ask as a father. And then, of course, when I disapprove of him, or if you don't like him, you can simply say, oh, my dad didn't give the okay. You can use me as an excuse too. So when my sister learned that I told Crystal this, my sister was horrified. No joke. That is scary. How in the world can you do that? But guess what? It turned out to be really helpful. Because today my daughter is married to a wonderful man and who makes us really feel that we have gained a son rather than lost a daughter. They have a Christian home, they are actively engaged in the church, and it was very useful for somebody who is dating your daughter to come speak to you first. Today is Father's Day. Father, take responsibility over your daughters, especially your daughters, and urge your daughter. You cannot compel, you can only suggest, you can only urge your daughters to say, if somebody asks you out, it is good and proper for him to ask permission. So now my son-in-law, he asked permission to bring my daughter out, take my daughter out. He asked permission to ask for my daughter's hand in marriage. And we have a good story and a good ending here. And Crystal decided it was a good thing to accept my offer to help. And so this helped move things along. Now, I cannot say you must do this thing, but I would certainly recommend it. And the point is this. The point is that you need to make your marriage choices carefully and deliberately. And it has to start at a very early stage, the going out stage. I mean, you cannot be doing all kinds of stuff and then at the end you've already decided and just ask for your parents' blessing. I mean, what else can they do but to bless, right? Otherwise, they will ask you to break off a 5-year relationship. They cannot do that either. So get it right at the very beginning and enlist the help of your parents. You believe that your parents want the best for you. And also pray for yourselves that the Lord will bring you good life partners. Now, what if you have done things that are not the best? You have married perhaps without all these Christian considerations. You were involved in the passion of the moment and you married somebody that perhaps may not be so ideal. But guess what? There is redemption, even if your situation is not all that it should be. The Apostle Paul tells us that even if your spouse is an unbeliever, that relationship can be sanctified through you, through what you are, through who you are, through your relationship with God. Things can be made good. Things can be made right. So don't give it up. Never say, oh, I made a mistake, so I'm out of here. That is never approved in Scripture. But even in a situation where things are not all that it should be, there is redemption, there is sanctification, your relationship, your marriage can be made holy because you are present in that relationship. So in conclusion then, we'll review the 4 points. That is, the accountability of the spiritual leader. He is accountable, unlike Eliashib, the high priest, who was not accountable. The second is the accountability of the officers. In any Christian community, the officers are accountable as much as the spiritual leader is accountable. The third is accountability for the day of rest. That one, you are accountable for your own day of rest. That you really need to work towards that because that is an anchoring point. When you come back Sunday after Sunday, even if people say things like, oh, it's just a habit and all that, that habit is still better than no habit. So make sure that you have an accountable day of rest. And fourth is accountability for your marriage. Run your marriage in such a way that you are accountable. In the life of Nehemiah, he accomplished building the walls. He set out to build a broken wall. But he realized that broken people are much harder to fix than broken walls. Nehemiah was capable, he was well placed, he was passionate, he was determined, he did what he could do. But he ends his life on a lingering note. It's just like some songs. Some songs don't end on a closing note, right? I think you know what I mean. I don't know what the name of such songs are. They kind of end on a lingering note so that It's as if the song is going to continue, like those perpetual songs that you sing round and round. So he was disappointed. His life ended like that. Having done what he ought to do, the people were still not where they ought to be. He could mend the broken wall, but he could not mend broken people. So Nehemiah's life and ours are like this. Our accountability to God is not success in what we do, but accountability for how we live. That is the case with Nehemiah and also with us. Now, your half-completed goals are exactly where they are supposed to be. You see, we seem to think that we are all in a individual race, and that when we complete the race, we hit the finishing line, we cross that finishing line, oh, my life is over, everything else is done, there is closure, and all that. But what if the race is a different kind of race? You see, God's plan is much bigger than our just individual race. It's just like a baton, a relay. And somebody passes you the baton, you take that baton, and then you run another round, and you pass it on to somebody else. Your job may be done in that race, your race may be over, but the entire race is not done. So that is the end of the race for us, but it is not the end of the race in God's plan. So like in the case of Nehemiah, we are in the middle of God's plan. So we should not expect a completed plan at the end of our life. I mean, we are not the focus. God has a much greater plan. All right. And then the one more thing we need to note is this, that there is greater purpose for Nehemiah's limited success. You see, from this time, from Nehemiah's reforms until when Jesus came, the Jews would be doing this and would be doing that, but they never fulfilled the great prophecies of the exilic prophets. People like Zechariah and all the other prophets during that time, saying that the Lord will come. The second temple will be more glorious than the first temple. The second temple would have strength and the nations would gather towards Jerusalem. Now, all that was never fulfilled. And can you imagine if that was fulfilled, what need is there of Jesus? It is the failure of the people to accomplish these great promises of God that caused them to look forward to that Messiah. Of course, in God's grand plan, he knew that they are not going to succeed. But Nehemiah is not the crescendo of the music. Nehemiah was a link to the Messiah. So we must not think of our lives as the crescendo of anything. We are the link to the next person. And Nehemiah's lack of total success in his life was actually total success in God's plan for his life. And so when we are faithful in loving God, in obeying him and serving his people, we are a success in God's eyes. Let us pray. Abba Father, we thank you for Jesus, the great high priest, who stood in contrast to Eliashib, the unfaithful high priest. Lord, give us this church of faithful leaders, faithful workers, that the word of God and the work of God may go forth. Lord, teach us also to cultivate this day of rest in our lives, regardless of what the society is doing, so that we do not stray from you. Lord, teach us to be accountable to you, even though the government may not be accountable to you right now in how they run the rest day, but we want to be accountable to you. And Lord, we want to be accountable to you also for our marriage. Some things may not be right now. Some things in our relationships may not be right. But Lord, we want to raise godly seed. So Lord, teach us to redeem whatever situation we have right now, to look at our failures and to make it right before you. And we ask all this for the sake of Jesus Christ, your Son, who made all things right. Amen.
We hope you have been blessed by Pastor Peter's sermon. We'd love to have you visit us at 31 Simei Road in Singapore for our in-person worship on Saturdays if you are able to get there. Details can be found at our website, thewell.sg. Have a wonderful week.